Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are finally here. It is MSI 2025 time around LoL Esports, around this channel, and I'm excited to finally be jumping into some content. If you are new to the channel, if you are just stopping by for some MSI content, welcome. I'm very happy to have you here. My name is Super K-Man Rocks. We've covered all 4 of the major regions all year long on this channel, as we have for the past 4 years. We've covered everything in LoL Esports, and I'm excited to jump into some MSI coverage as well, talking about all of the teams and just generally what you can expect. To kick off our MSI coverage, we are going to be doing our meta report here today. That's what you clicked on, but tomorrow on this channel, we are going to have our big primer and power rankings video where I not only power rank all 10 teams at the tournament, I power rank every single player in their position at the tournament as well, kind of giving my thoughts and expectations, giving a general range of outcomes for each team, and, you know, playstyle expectations for maybe people who haven't watched every single team or anything like that, maybe what you can expect, where teams are strong, where teams are weak, all of that stuff. So if you're excited for that, stick around for tomorrow. But today we're going to be covering everything you need to know about the champions you can expect and the meta that is likely going to generate around this tournament. But there are some disclaimers I do want to get to at the beginning of this video. First and foremost, obviously this is a projection. There are going to be some teams that, you know, have discovered things in scrims over the past couple of weeks, the past week really, and have kind of clicked into place for them and been like, oh, this champion's actually going to be really good in this instance, and, you know, maybe nobody's playing this champion, but it can be really valuable for us here at MSI, and perhaps the scrim meta just in general surrounding MSI has illuminated a couple of picks here or there. But for the most part, I'm going to be going over everything that I'm expecting to see at this tournament. The way that this is going to be broken down, we're going to go position by position, role by role, from top, jungle, mid, AD carry, and support in that order. We'll be giving a tier 1 and a tier 2 for every single role. Tier 1 is going to be every champion that you can expect to see in almost every best of 5. These are champions that are quite defining at the position right now, are either much stronger than everybody else, or just offer a ridiculous amount of utility, are very consistent, etc. These are the champions that kind of warp the meta around them. That doesn't mean these are all of the top tier champions or the most viable champions. That's where tier 2 comes in. There are a couple of different types of champions in tier 2, either the champions that are a clear step down from tier 1 but are still very good. Maybe they do the role of a champion in tier 1, but they do it slightly worse, and so they're picked in Fearless when those champions are off the board. Or alternatively, they're champions that can be a little bit more, you know, specific in terms of the situations that they're picked. They're not quite as meta defining, but in their situations they can be just as strong as tier 1 picks. I've also sprinkled in a couple that I think might sneak their way into the meta that haven't been particularly popular over the course of this year. That's mostly what tier 2 is for. Biggest disclaimer possible, there are going to be champions in, not in this video, I should say, champions not listed in either tier 1 or tier 2 that get a significant amount of play at MSI. I'm expecting that. These are really just the champions that I think you have to prep for. There are a lot of champions, and I'll kind of go over them per position, that you could theoretically list on here, but I just don't think are noteworthy enough in order to generate their own personal spot. So I hope that makes sense, but I'm excited to get into it today. There is a lot to cover, every single position, every single role. So without further ado, let's get into it. Our first position, obviously, we're going to start at the top, and that means we're starting with the top lane position. And up on the screen, you can see the tier 1 top laners. There are only 3 for me that kind of warp the entire meta around them. Every other top laner I think is much more situational in terms of how they might want to approach a specific matchup. Each team is going to value certain top laners over others just depending on how they like to play the game, but these are the 3 that you're going to see in basically every single series in some way, shape, or form. The most notable of the 2 being Gwen and Rumble. You can see them kind of listed at the top. These are your 2 S-tier top laners. They still are, even after the nerfs, and you know, there's a lot to talk about when it comes to maybe some of the changes, and we'll get to that in tier 2. I think top lane was most affected by the last 2 patches, by 0.11 and 0.12 and 0.13, and all of those changes kind of going through, and so, you know, we'll kind of get to some of those, but Gwen and Rumble are still your S-tier top laners, and the ones that I think most teams are going to be willing to fight over. Gwen is going to be basically permabanned against a lot of teams at this tournament, specifically teams like Billy Gaming and Bin, teams like Gen G and Keen. You don't really want to give them Gwen because they just do so much in terms of the team fighting, and the consistency just goes through the roof. roof. It can shred tanks, and so you can't really play weak side against it. And also, of course, Gwen is just a nuisance in general. That's not even accounting for the fact that these players have a lot of experience on her. So Gwen, to me, still the number one top laner in the game right now in terms of what I'm expecting. The AP damage is just ridiculously high. And then if you want to go for a more stable team fight threat, Rumble is obviously kind of the clear answer to Gwen. When you want to go for something that can also deal damage and can also be a threat in the 5v5s, Rumble's Equalizer is still the best thing in team fights in the entire game. You're still able to set up entirely consistently without really anybody else on the team. It's not like a lot of these other team fight champions that kind of need follow through. You know, something like a Wukong, which we will talk about later in the jungle. Probably the best team fight engager is entirely useless if you don't have somebody that can follow up on his team fight engage. Rumble is very self-sustainable, is good in lane against most things, obviously can lose early on to things like Gwen if they are going to play rather aggressive, but for the most part, what you get out of Rumble is a champion that's going to be useful every game, no matter what, which is why he's been prioritized so heavily at the top of a lot of these drafts, basically, in every single region. So Gwen and Rumble are kind of 1A, 1B. I think Gwen is better, but I do think that Rumble, as a consistent piece, is maybe even going to be higher priority for quite a few teams at this tournament that don't want to play around something like Gwen. And then I think Sion deserves to be here in Tier 1, if only because he is the prominent weak side tank in the top lane right now. There just aren't a lot of weak side tanks that teams feel comfortable picking. We'll talk about a couple of the other ones in Tier 2, but for the most part, Sion is the one that people are going to go to when you see really aggressive early game oriented picks, maybe something like a Nidalee top at this tournament. Sion is likely going to be the chosen answer to things like that because of just how consistent he's going to be. Obviously, his team fights are great. His scaling is built into his kit, so he doesn't really have to worry about it too much. And honestly, his lane matchups are better than he gets credit for. There are quite a few that he actually does relatively well in. These are the only three top laners that I feel confident I'm going to see in every single best of 5. I would be shocked if teams just overlooked these guys, and you know, I imagine Gwen and Rumble are going to receive a lot of bans. Gwen in particular is likely going to be banned more than she will be picked at this tournament, but that leaves things like Rumble open, and that certainly leaves an angle for things like Sion to be picked more. So those are kind of the meta warping top laners, at least the ones that I think are going to get the most play, and that transitions us into Tier 2 for top lane. And like I said before, essentially what Tier 2 is champions that I think will get a consistent amount of play, will be played in either most of the best of 5s, like over 50% or close to it. Champions that I think are, you know, very good, and we'll talk about some Tier 3 quote-unquote top laners that I think could sneak their way into the meta here. But as you can see up on the screen, it's Yorick, Mbessa, Jace, Jax, Nidalee, and then I have Aurelia with a star next to her because she's one of the few champions who got buffs over the last few patches that I actually think might just enter the meta. Everything else has kind of been more up in the air, at least in my opinion, but Aurelia's changes have just made her stronger and stronger, and I think we're starting to get to a point where Aurelia as a counter pick on the top side of the map might actually be super valuable late on in a Fearless draft. Again, we'll talk about that when we get there, but we can kind of sort these into categories for top lane here. If you want something that's more self-sustaining and weak side, Mbessa outside of Sion is likely going to be the one you go for. She can be really good in lane. I think her early game is very underrated by a lot of analysts out there, and I also do think that obviously her teamfight ultimate can just change things up. A lot of players at this tournament have played a ton of Mbessa. I would be surprised if we don't see probably the most of her of anybody on this list. I think she still is in a great spot. K'Sante can also kind of fit that role to a lesser extent. I think K'Sante's numbers are just worse. Mbessa's basically just better K'Sante at the current moment. So that's what I would expect there. You've got your split pushers, Yorick and Jax, that I think are basically answers to each other. Yorick could make a case to be in Tier 1. I think he's the one champion here that you could consider meta warping. Even if we're going to see more Mbessa than we are going to see Yorick, you have to be ready to play against a Yorick, and there's a high probability that specifically, you know, LPL teams and, you know, teams coming from the East are going to value Yorick maybe more so than teams from the West. We've seen that pretty historically, not only for the champion, but this year in particular. The LPL's priority on a champion like Yorick is incredibly high, certainly Tier 1 worthy. I just don't think we're going to see that from every single team at the tournament, which is why he ends up landing here in Tier 2, but still the premier split pusher. We'll see if teams actually want to try to utilize him in that way, because we've seen so many teams just pick Yorick and then teleport him in for every team fight. Not necessarily the way I would personally play the champion, but Jax has kind of been considered the pseudo answer to that playstyle. You can pick Jax in a couple of different scenarios. I think he has fallen off in terms of popularity and consistency, but especially in these Fearless drafts, we're going to be seeing a ton of him in games 3, 4, 5 if we do ever get to those, and I think that's worth kind of putting him in Tier 2. I would imagine he has a higher than 50% presence rate throughout this tournament, at least if I had to say so. Yorick definitely will, Jax probably will. And then you have your early kind of lane dominant champions in Jace and Nidalee. almost your really risky picks. Jace is just naturally always going to be in the meta because he's the most consistent laner in the top lane in the entire game. If you want to brutalize top lane, Jace is the way to pick it, and I think that that is something that, you know, a lot of teams are still going to opt into. Again, with Fearless, those options kind of get taken off the board, and so, you know, something like Jace just inherently becomes more valuable when you don't have as many early game answers. If things like Scion that just kind of, you know, play passive in the early game are taken off the board early on in a Fearless draft, Jace becomes more valuable. Nidalee is kind of in the same vein. If you followed this channel for any extended period of time, you'll know how I feel about Nidalee top as just a pick in general. I think it's complete troll. I think you're actively trying to lose the game if you pick it. I think it does basically nothing. You know, I've seen some arguments being like, well, what Nidalee does is soften up towers so that you can basically donate free tower gold over to whatever hyper carry you want to get gold on. And if that's the case, then why do you not just pick a weak side top laner and just play for your bot lane, like 3-man bot lane all the time? If you're just trying to funnel gold into the AD carry, why don't you just actually do that rather than picking Nidalee top and feeling like you have agency? This champion doesn't really do anything in the late game, but people are going to pick her. Like, that has become very clear. A lot of teams out there really like this champion. I just think it's a complete waste of time. Worth noting, the Shy nor Zeus are at this tournament. They have been the most prominent Nidalee players in the world, and so maybe her priority does go down at least a little bit, but players like Mirwin, I'm sure, are going to be itching to bring her out, but she's basically just worse Jace in terms of how she scales into the late game. Again, the reason I put Aurelia on here is because I do think the buffs have actually mattered. I think she's in a really good spot as a counter pick. I don't know if teams are actually going to be playing her. You know, I'm not going to try and, you know, leak anything here. I do have a little bit of information on what's going on in scrims, and, you know, generally speaking, Aurelia has at least been something that's been thrown out. I don't know if that will make its way to stage, but if it does, just be prepared for it because I do think she's in a good spot. Another champion that received a couple buffs over the past couple patches was Gangplank. People might be interested in playing that. There aren't really a lot of Gangplank players at this tournament, at least ones that kind of stand out in my brain. If someone like Impact from Team Liquid was at this tournament, I would be a lot more willing to consider that on here, but he's just significantly too slow for the meta that we're in right now, and he doesn't match up particularly well against the tier 1 top laners, and so it's just hard for me to find a world where he ends up fitting in. But there are other top laners also, again, that are off this list. Ornn is going to get quite a lot of picks, probably not above 50%, but he will be active at the tournament. Renekton is obviously something that's basically always going to be relevant. There are other top laners that I think are playable, and of course with players like Mirwin at the tournament, you might see like a top lane Varus or something strange. Top lane Nico, I think, is something that's been thrown around, like that old on-hit Nico style. So there are other top lane picks. I think this is the most varied in terms of the champion pools, at least in terms of expecting things that are not on this list to actually make an appearance, but these are the ones that I would expect to kind of take over. It's really just about the classification do you want. If you can't get Gwen or Rumble in terms of being able to get one of those S-tier top laners, then do you want to go offensive? Do you want to go defensive? Do you want to go team fight? Do you want to go split push? At that point, you just follow your flowchart and pick the champion that best suits your team's needs. But then moving on now to jungle, our second position of the video, and tier 1 is going to be up on the screen now. These are not going to be surprising or shocking to anybody who's followed the meta over the past couple of months. These are basically the champions that have run things throughout the entirety of 2025, and there's really not been any changes that I think will change that. At least the tier 1. I think there are some champions that, again, could kind of break through into tier 2 and perhaps, you know, really rise in terms of popularity, but I mean, we're still going to get it defined by skirmishes in the early game. If you can, that's great. If you can't, then you need to be able to team fight at an elite level, and that's what tier 1 is about. Vi, Xin Zhao, Pantheon, Sejuani are the 4 champions that I have in tier 1. For jungle, Vi in particular here is the one that it seems most teams want to prioritize. Do I believe that Vi is the number 1 jungler in the game? No, I do not. I think Xin Zhao is significantly more consistent. I think Xin Zhao does more for the game than Vi does, but as we've seen, Vi is just generally what teams want to prioritize more heavily, basically everywhere, in every region, and I get it. The Q cooldown's like 2 seconds when you max it. Your consistent engage is just not like that on any other champion. There's nobody else who can do what Vi does as easily as Vi can do it. The only issue I have with Vi is that if she loses in the early game, if she doesn't really have a ton of gold going into the late game, then she dies really fast. Like, she's super squishy without gold, and that can be a bit of a problem if she is your primary form of engage in the back half of the game. But at the end of the day, when you can do it as frequently and as consistently as Vi can, it makes sense that a lot of teams just want to prioritize her as the number 1 jungler in the game. But to me, Xin Zhao should be able to hold that spot. I think his early skirmishing is still the best. I think Pantheon obviously has an argument to be there for the best early skirmisher, but what Xin Zhao offers is the ability to play through any lane really at any given time. One of the big things about Pantheon, at least in the way that he has translated to pro, is that a lot of teams really feel the need to play him with something else that can be, some sort of global, like some sort of semi-global, whether that's Talia, whether that's Ryze, Galio, whatever, right? Like even Twisted Fate, which we will talk about a little bit later. Like Pantheon kind of needs to be played with something else that can be a bit of a macro threat, and I just don't think Xin Zhao has that problem. He can play with basically anything. If you want to play him with scalers, he can invest a lot into that lane. Like if you want to play him with Azir or whatever in the mid lane, you can give Azir a lot of resources just by having Xin Zhao fight mid lane over and over again and kind of create situations around things like grubs that kind of force teams into, exchanging with him. Or alternatively, if you want to play with Talia, if you want to play with these more early game aggressive mid laners, even something like a Yone, you can just kind of run around the map and take basically anything that you want. There's not a lot of duos in the league that are going to be mid-jungle duos, I should say, in the game that are really going to be able to match that kind of combat power. So Xin Zhao offers a lot, Vi offers a lot, Pantheon also offers a lot, and quite frankly, he is meta shifting in terms of the way he does things. Do I think he's quite as good as people might make him out to be right now? Maybe not. I think he's a very good jungler. Would I prioritize him personally in tier 1? I don't know. I think the things he does really well are incredibly strong. I think his ability to control the map in the early game is better than anybody else in the game. I think his ability to run the first 10, 12, 14 minutes of the game, he really kind of gets to determine and decide where he wants to put the resources and where the enemy team has to react. And that's even into things like Xin Zhao and Vi for the most part from what we've seen. But the problem with Pantheon is first of all, he doesn't do anything in the late game. Xin Zhao at the very least has a very good ultimate, and Vi is always going to be consistent and engaged. Pantheon is completely useless after 20 minutes. He just doesn't really offer much, especially when he doesn't have gold. If he does have gold, he can still do quite a bit of damage if you build him that way, but without that, he's not particularly tanky. He doesn't scale naturally, and so he does need some injections in the early game. And also, again, I think teams kind of fall into the trap of feeling like they have to pick Pantheon Talia, Pantheon Ryze, Pantheon Galio in order to pilot the champion really at any level. And I just don't think that has to be the case. You can kind of run around and do whatever you want. That doesn't mean you have to have a macro threat to match the Pantheon ultimate. But those are the 3 aggressive champions that are really going to run a lot of teams' mentalities. I imagine they're going to be picked or banned in almost every single game. Sejuani, on the other hand, not going to be nearly there in terms of presence, but is the #1 facilitative jungler in the game. She has fallen off a bit in terms of priority, and I think there are a few teams at this tournament that just do not care to play facilitative junglers, but the teams that do will likely prioritize Sejuani even over things like Pantheon in terms of how this goes, and so I think she does earn her place in tier 1. I still think she's just as strong as she has been for a very long time. I think she is a great frontliner. I think her CC chain is very difficult to break through. She's still a decent skirmisher in the early game, which is what makes her different than things like Maokai that really aren't particularly consistent in that phase of the game. She's just a little bit better at most things, even if she's not quite as good at like holding area or, objective control, those kinds of things that things like Maokai are very good at that we will talk about later. Sejuani doesn't quite have that, but she still is the most versatile, I would say, facilitative jungler in the game, which is why she's still here in tier 1. But as you can see, the meta has really revolved around who can make the most amount of plays in the early game, who can get things snowballed, and I think that transitions nicely into tier 2 as well. And this is going to be a much bigger list than it was for top lane, mostly because, like I said, I think there's a lot of like quote-unquote tier 3 top laners that are going to get play, but aren't necessarily going to get a ton of play. I think jungle is a little bit more defined in terms of just like how these teams end up wanting to draft. I think there are multiple modes, but I think most of them are pretty easy to talk about. Are there junglers that I didn't put on this list that I think could be considered? Yes, but I think these are the main ones that you should really be looking out for. You've got your subsections as per usual. You've got your team fighters, you've got your carries, you've got your skirmishers, and you've got your facilitators. And obviously they all kind of break down in a couple of different ways. Let's talk about the team fighters first and foremost. Most notably Wukong, but I think Poppy also kind of fits into this. Poppy kind of the half facilitator, half team fighter here, but Wukong's still your best team fighting gauge in the entire game. The problem for Wukong is that his early game is significantly worse than it was, say, last year before a lot of the nerfs, and he's just not particularly consistent in that phase of the game. And when you're looking at things like Vi and Xin Zhao and Pantheon, like Wukong's not going to have a great time early into a lot of those picks, and so he's often utilized later on in drafts, but he should get a ton of presence. Again, I still think he's the most consistent engage threat in the entire game if you can set him up correctly. It just takes a very specific team comp in order to make the most of him. You really need to play him with hyper carries, whether that's in the mid lane or in the bot lane. Like, Wukong Zeri is great. Wukong Azir is great. Wukong playing with, Talia and Misfortune, maybe not as good, right? Like, maybe not the situation you'd want to draft him in. And so he does end up landing in tier 2 because of that. I think Poppy also generally falls into that. Poppy is good, first of all, because she's a flex pick, but also because she just shuts down most of the good things in the meta. Turns out a lot of champions dash. Like, that's just kind of how it goes. Mobility is really good in the game, and when you are a tank that can knock people out of fights, that can survive a lot of damage and can stop dashes, you turn out to be pretty valuable. I think if someone like Peanut was at this tournament, I perhaps would have Poppy in tier 1 and expect her to be played or banned a lot more, but not really a ton of Poppy players here. A lot of them will play Poppy if they need to, but not really players that are known for playing the champion, and so she ends up landing in tier 2. I think she should absolutely be in tier 1, just in terms of the power level and what she offers towards teams, but teams don't seem to value her in the same way. Those are kind of your team fight engagers. You have your team fight carries. That's mainly going to be Neferi here, and some people might argue that Neferi is still tier 1. I don't think Neferi is quite as meta-defining as maybe they were at the beginning of the year. Neferi is still very strong, and I think if you get fed on that champ, it's really easy to snowball a game out of control. But the problem is it's just not quite as easy. You're not doing quite as much damage, especially in the early game, and we've seen that priority fall off after the nerfs. I imagine we're still going to see quite a bit of Neferi later on in games, especially from teams that want to play through jungle and want to try to play aggressive, but maybe not quite as much as we saw earlier on in the year. And I think the other kind of carry-oriented champion here is going to be Kindred, and Kindred's not really been super meta. Kindred would not normally be on this list if it were just for her performances over the course of 2025, but what I think separates Kindred and kind of differentiates her is the buffs that she got over the course of the last few patches, most notably the cooldown buff to her ultimate. It goes down like 20 seconds at every rank or something like that, 10, 20 seconds in terms of cooldown at every rank. That's a very big deal for pro play. Kindred is almost entirely picked for her ability to ult and for her combo potential with other mid laners and just other champions in general that can take advantage of, basically team-wide invulnerability. Like, Kindred can make a lot of use of that, and a lot of, popular champions can make a lot of use of that. And so I think with that ultimate cooldown going down, Kindred's probably going to see a big uptick in play rate. I would imagine, actually, of all the champions buffed across the last few patches, I would expect Kindred to be the one that sneaks her way into the meta the most of basically all of them. We'll see if I'm right or wrong about that, but I think Kindred is a champion that I'm kind of calling out to see a big rise in play rate on this patch. But those are kind of your late game carries. Kindred can still be a marksman in the late game if you do want to play for double marksman comps. Obviously, you know how Kindred works if you're watching this video, but that's the reason I think she's coming back into the meta. You've got your skirmishers as well here. That's mostly just going to be Nocturne in terms of how he wants to play the early game. Theoretically, you could put something like Poppy into this conversation as well, but Nocturne is really just going to be utilized to pair up with some of these, more aggressive skirmish mid laners if you don't have the opportunity to take Vi or Pantheon or Xin Zhao early on in the draft. Nocturne Orianna is still a very good combo, but we've seen Nocturne kind of branch out into a couple of others as well. I still think he'll get picked quite a bit at this tournament, even if I think he's much more niche than he was before. And then kind of your tier 2 facilitators, you're not Sejuani's, Trundle, Maokai, Skarner. Trundle in particular has really risen in popularity over the past couple of months. This is somebody that I think a lot of teams might even be looking at as a tier 1 champion going into this. I don't see that in his kit. I don't think he's quite good enough to be considered a tier 1 champion, but he certainly is good enough to be considered the best outside of Sejuani. If you maybe wanted to make the argument that Trundle might see more play than Sejuani at this tournament, I could kind of listen to that just because of the way things have gone over the course of the past few months, the trajectory that Trundle has been on, but I just don't see it in the champ, and so I'm going to leave him at tier 2 for now. Maokai, Skarner, they're just kind of, options at the end of Fearless Draft. I don't think a lot of people are looking at these guys as particularly, strong or just, unbelievably broken. Maokai has been in the past, and he always rises in popularity and pick rate at big tournaments, international tournaments, and so I would expect him to, once again, rise to be, I don't know, the 5th or 6th most played jungler at this tournament. I just don't think he's in a state where he's going to dominate the meta, or you have to worry about him too much in game 1 or game 2. If teams do pick him there, it's because they want a very specific style. Again, the best objective control and the best area control in the entire game. Outside of that, not really much else. He still can tank up a ton, but the ultimate is really what you draft him for at this point. And then Skarner. Skarner still is a playmaking, facilitative, hybrid champion. I actually still think Skarner's very good, even after all the nerfs. Can he tank a ton right now? Probably not. He's not Maokai, he's not Trundle, he's not Sejuani, he's not even really Poppy in terms of what he can tank on the front line, but the ultimate's always good, Impale's always always good, and really good Skarner players can make some really creative plays with him even in the early game, and so that's what I think gives him a bit of an edge over something like Maokai, at least in my eyes, is I think he just has more options and more agency. But those are kind of your tier 2 junglers. Again, I think that there are others in the meta that theoretically could get play. You know, things like Viego, Lilia, you got Jarvan, you've got Ivern, Dr. Mundo's been really strong in solo queue. Like, there are other junglers that I think will make some sort of appearance at this tournament, but for the most part, I think those are going to be under 30% in terms of presence rate. These are the junglers that I would expect to be more defining in terms of just their roles at this tournament, and that's why they're here in tier 2. Once again, I think once you don't get Vi, Xin Zhao, or Pantheon, even Sejuani, like that tier 1, I do think you very much have to get a lot more specialized, but most of these junglers can fit in a lot of different circumstances. And again, very similar to the top lane conversation, it's really just about the team comp that you want to play around it. But that's going to bring us to mid lane up next, and mid's probably the most versatile position in the game right now, just in terms of the breadth of what you can pick in that role with so many different playstyles coming through, and that kind of showcases itself in tier 1, which you can see up on the screen. Now you can see the largest tier 1 that we've gotten so far, I believe the second largest of any position outside of support. We will see how that ends up going, but a lot of different options in the mid lane, just kind of depending on what you want to do, and that's what makes Fearless so interesting, is that it's kind of forced a lot of these teams to play different styles and to kind of be able to match anything in the middle of the map right now. And you can, again, see that in the just kind of different styles in tier 1 by itself. All of these are going to have their backups, quote unquote, further down in tier 2, but these are definitely the main 5. They consist of Taliyah, Azir, Yone, Ahri, and Ryze. I think these are the 5 like meta warping mid laners right now. I wouldn't necessarily say that all of them are of equal skill level. Like, I think Taliyah is the best mid laner in the game. I think she does everything at a relatively decent level. Of course, she is one of the best early game shove and roam type of champions ever, if not the best at that style. Her kit is literally built for it. She is able to move so quickly, not only because of her ultimate, but because of her passive. Her shove ability is insane. Her wave clear is really good. Her damage in the back half of the game can still be very valuable, even if I do think she's a bit overrated as a secondary carry in the current meta, definitely as a primary carry. I see a lot of people talking about her as if she can be your #1 option in team fights. I'm really not sold on that idea. I think oftentimes you just end up lacking damage, but Taliyah does so much. She pairs perfectly with a lot of the junglers in the current meta. She's the #1 mid laner in the game, as she has been for a very long time in pro play right now, basically ever since she got mini reworked. Azir is kind of the other one that everybody just plays. Like, it's Azir. You know what you're going to get out of Azir. There's honestly nothing I can say about that champion that you don't already know. He's not falling out of the meta anytime soon. He's gonna be a meta mid laner forever. Every mid laner plays him. Every single team wants to invest into him, even early in drafts. Do I think he's exploitable? Yes. I think especially in this meta where things like Taliyah, Ahri, Ryze, we'll get to Galio a little bit later, like those champs have a really good matchup, generally speaking, into Azir because he can't match any of their mid game pressure. He doesn't really want to skirmish all that much in a lot of the early game, but if you want to carry in the mid lane, like if you want someone that can deal damage and win team fights in the back half of the game, there is still none better than Azir, at least none more consistent. Ahri and Ryze I'm going to talk about next. We'll get back to Yone in just a moment, but they're kind of along the same lines as what we had in Taliyah, but they're just slightly worse. I still think that they are meta defining in terms of how good they are, because you have to care about them in basically every single series. It's likely that they're going to get picked or banned in almost every single series that we see at this tournament. But again, I think they are kind of considered a little bit worse than Taliyah. Ryze definitely pairs up more with things like Pantheon, wants to move around the map and wants to be able to create a lot of these macro plays, is still very good late game. In fact, I think he's a bit underrated in terms of a team fight carry at this point. It's really just his lack of range that ends up being a bit of a problem for him when he wants to try to fight late. Ahri, on the other hand, also kind of a roam, shove and roam, play the map kind of threat, but pairs much better with things like Vi and things like Xin Zhao, because she does want to skirmish. Like, she is the best mid-game skirmisher in the mid lane. Like, period, end of story. If you want to fight a lot around the mid-game, if you want to get picks, if you want to play around, consistent engages, there is just not a champion that's going to be able to do that nearly as consistently as Ahri is going to be able to do it. So Taliyah, Ahri, Ryze, all kind of a part of the same coin in the sense that they all want to play through the mid-game, but they do it in very different ways. Ryze is going to be much more conditioned for, split pushing in the late game and being able to team fight, but still having pressure because of his global. You have Taliyah, who's definitely going to be more, facilitative for, I guess, damage-oriented junglers because her setup's really good, but she herself also has damage. And Ahri is much more for the pick potential that she offers, which is why she's often paired up with the best jungler in the game in Vi, or at least the most popular jungler in pro play right now in Vi. So those three, I think, all kind of fill similar niches, but are all going to be picked relatively consistently because that niche is so good. And then you have Yone, the final champion here. He's really just kind of your aggressive pick here in the mid lane. If you want to try and win the game on your own and showcase your individual mechanical skill, Yone's still very good for that. And that's a big reason why Sejuani is also still in tier 1 for the junglers. I think without Yone being as good as he is, Sejuani might fall. And specifically with a lot of these comps that want to play for things like Gwen and Rumble on the top side, perhaps you do need to diversify your damage profile a bit more and pick something like Yone in the mid lane. We're going to see a lot of, Gwen, Sejuani, Yone comps, as we have throughout basically the entirety of this year. And I think Yone is not only the best AD mid laner in the game right now, but certainly one of the most dominant in terms of 1v1 duels. And just, his ultimate can still be gigantic in team fights. He just is an all-around very good mid laner, and I think he deserves to be in tier 1. Even if I personally think his role is a little bit more niche compared to the other 4 on this list, I still think his, presence rate is probably going to be up there with a lot of the other champions. But that transitions us to tier 2, and I was a little bit less gung-ho just about throwing champions up for tier 2 because I think a lot of champions are actually going to be kind of fitting into the tier 1 and tier 2 mold. I think there's less tier 3 picks that are probably going to be as popular as there are for some other positions in the mid lane because the good mid laners kind of do what you want to do. It's very, I would be shocked if somebody else kind of emerged here. Again, we'll talk about some picks that I think theoretically could be there, but as you can see on your screen, my tier 2 is Galio, Akali, Sylas, Orianna, Annie, and Aurora. Again, all of these champions kind of doing different things and all being used in different roles. Consider Galio your macro backup if Talia and Ryze are off the board, either because they've been picked or banned on the other side of the matchup, or if it's late in Fearless. Galio still works very well with things like, obviously, Pantheon, with things like Xin Zhao, things like Vi. Galio can operate still, really well in those situations. He technically is a flex pick to go top lane if you really wanted to try to make that work. I don't think Galio top is in as good of a spot as it has been previously, but it still is definitely playable. I think also specifically, we talked about this in tier 2, but Kindred coming back into the meta, something that I'm kind of projecting to happen over the course of this tournament, could make Galio an even higher priority in terms of how things go. Galio, Kindred, of course, very famous as a mid-jungle duo. Everybody else has their own little thing that they do. I think Aurora, ironically enough, is kind of your Yone backup in this case. Sylas kind of fits into that mold as well, where these are champions that just kind of do a little bit of everything. You can find picks with them. If you need to mid-game skirmish with them, you absolutely can. But for the most part, you're going to try your best to play from ahead with these champions because playing from behind makes them a little bit less useful. They're going to be useful both in duels, in skirmishes, as well as, of course, in late-game team fights. I think Aurora is a tad bit less consistent than something like Sylas. I think both of them are less consistent than something like Yone in the role, but overall, it's all really personal player preference. You could even theoretically throw Akali in there. I just think Akali's role is different than those two champions. I think Akali is entirely here to play. I would argue, Akali's more of a backup to Ahri than she is to Sylas or Aurora or Yone or anything like that. I think Akali's entire thing is just, can we get this player onto the backline? Can we cause disruption for a comp that maybe wants to play front to back? We've seen it used very sparingly, not only as a counterpick to enemy mid laners, but specifically as a counterpick to the general meta. I think if you're going to be looking at more Azir coming in, Akali could rise in popularity, but look at the rest of these champions. Like Orianna and Annie, maybe Orianna definitely, but not really a lot of backline mid lane targets to be able to try and assassinate if you're an Akali. I think it's really just player preference whether you want to pull her out. Orianna's going to be your standard control mage that's kind of near the top right now. If you don't want to play Azir, it's likely going to be Orianna if you want something stable in the mid lane. Ori's just, she's Orianna. Like, she doesn't really change. Her numbers aren't particularly good right now, but it doesn't really matter. Annie is the last one to talk about, at least from this list, and Annie's whole goal and the whole reason she's come back into the meta is because she is probably the best setup mid laner in the game for carry junglers. If you want to play something like Neferi, I think even something like Kindred, as you move forward, Annie could be a really good threat in that regard. We've even seen things like Annie and Nocturne come out. Orianna Nocturne is obviously a lot more popular, but Annie is just one of those champions that does a really good job and is really, really simple at setting up for other carries to be able to take over, specifically ones that want to try and dominate through the jungle. So expect to see Annie Neferi, expect to see Annie Kindred, potentially as duos. She's going to continue having her role there. I would not like to see Annie plus Vi or Xin Zhao or Pantheon, which I know might seem a little bit counterintuitive because they are the most common junglers in the game, but I think Annie's role, while niche, is still, common enough for me to include her on this list. And so that's kind of it for the main mid laners. I think that there are some others that could theoretically get in, but it's not like top and jungle. We're at a couple, tier 3 champions that I can pretty much guarantee are going to get a good amount of play. Basically, all the champions that I think are going to get a good amount of play are here. I don't think mid's quite as deep. I just think it's very diverse in terms of the way that you want to go about it. Like, there are champions that are clearly just better than other champions at specific roles. If, theoretically you're starting to get to a game 4 or a game 5 and things like Galio, Ryze, Talia are all off the board and you still want a macro threat, Twisted Fate has been destroying solo queue. He has been lighting things up, but I think the problem for TF is just that his timers aren't as good for pro as they are in solo queue in terms of how things happen. Could we see some Twisted Fate at this tournament? I think it's possible. I would bet against him being like a regular fixture. I don't think he's going to skyrocket into the meta, even though he's gotten so much stronger over the course of the patches since, 15.11 or 25.11, whatever technically they're calling him nowadays, right? I think he's still good. I just don't know if I'm expecting to see him in pro. There are other options for team fighters. Things like Victor are definitely still playable. Hui is a champion that can offer you a bit of range, maybe be an answer to something like Varus that's going to be very common. You have things like Syndra that could theoretically reappear in the meta as well. Like, there are other mid laners, but I think all of those champs just are worse at what they do than a champion that I've already talked about. And so I just don't feel particularly confident in talking about that. LeBlanc's another one, by the way. If you just really want to one-shot somebody, like, LeBlanc is a champion that does what she does really well, kind of in the Akali mold, except with significantly less utility and significantly less consistent, because you need a ton of gold in order to make LeBlanc work. But again, there are theoretical options to fill these roles that aren't on this list. I just think all of them are worse, and so it didn't feel worthwhile listing. But again, mid is very much, even more so, I would say, than top and jungle. What are you trying to do? Like, this determines how you want to play the game. Things like Vise and Zhao Pantheon, yes, they can determine, maybe the direction you want to go in. Your mid laner basically completely defines your play style in the current meta, so it's very important to get it right. Then moving on to the AD carry role, and this one is going to be much easier to talk about than maybe the last 3 that we went over. AD carry is almost always the shortest discussion in these meta report videos because it's just like, who does your AD carry play best? Like, it genuinely does come down to that. I do think there is a tier 1 and then a bunch of, champions in tier 2. Let's go ahead and throw tier 1 up. These are the champs that I think are just a little bit stronger right now than maybe everybody else. Headlined, of course, by Varus. If you want an AD carry that's good in every single circumstance, that's what Varus does at a very high level. His early game is very good because his range is great, and so his 2v2 potential is pretty solid. He's a decent skirmisher. His damage can get pretty high pretty quick. He doesn't exactly, falter at one item like a lot of the other early game AD carries do, things like Lucian and Misfortune that aren't quite as good after, 2 items or whatever. Varus can still hyper carry in the late game. He can still be a primary option if you want to play for him. Maybe not quite as much as hyper carries. Maybe he doesn't dominate lane as much as like the truly lane dominant picks, but he is your all-around jack of all trades AD carry, and that's the reason why he's been the #1 ADC in the entire game, because there's really just not a lot that he does poorly. He can fit into any comp in any circumstance. His build can dictate exactly the direction that you want to go. It's flexible enough in that way. Like, Varus is just really good, and we've seen him continue to rise in popularity because of that, especially as teams got into the playoffs. This is a champion that I imagine will be taken off the board very quickly in a lot of best of 5s, but you also have some really lane dominant picks that you do have to at the very least be watching out for, because I do think they are meta defining, and that's Lucian and Kalista. I think for different reasons, even though they are kind of the same champion, Kalista is much more dominant in the 2v2, and Lucian is much more dominant in the early game skirmishes, and I do think that that matters. Like, that distinction, ends up translating a little bit to what you want to draft around it. Kalista kind of needs to be strong side. Lucian a little bit less so, although you do want to try and play around this Lucian early. You want to try to get them both gold, but at the end of the day, Kalista is also going to do much better in the late game than something like Lucian is. I just think both of them kind of deserve to be considered a half a tier above every other AD carry. Do I think they're as good as Varus and as versatile as Varus? No. Did I want to have one champion in tier 1? No. I wanted to put something else here, and I do think Lucian and Kalista are likely going to be your 2 other highest priority AD carries in the game. Lucian's just been rising in popularity slowly throughout the year because people realize that, oh, we're playing Xin Zhao, Vi, Pantheon every game, might as well have an AD carry that can win fights at that stage, and Kalista has just been dominant throughout the entire year. Teams have gotten better at being able to deal with her, but they've also tried to come up with some overthinking answers to Kalista that we've seen her punish quite a bit. I still think in the right hands, this champion can absolutely decimate. And so for me, Varus kind of your tier 1, and then Lucian, Kalista kind of your tier 1.5 if you really want to move it in that direction. But that transitions us into tier 2, and this is where things get crowded because there's a lot of champions that you can consider for tier 2. And honestly, there's like 6 or 7 that that I didn't even include on this list that I will talk about, and this is where kind of the disclaimer comes in. You just got to pick what you're good at. You got to pick what you want to play and what kind of fits the idea of the comp that you're looking to play, because basically everything is playable right now in the AD carry role with the exception of, like, I don't know, Samira. You can probably play a little bit of everything. Hell, you could probably play Samira in pro play. I just don't think it's necessarily something that teams want to play around, but you kind of have to break them up into archetypes and just generally look at what each AD carry is good at. You've got the ones that are, you know, more dual-oriented, can be pretty good in the early game, can take over in the late game, but aren't hyper carries, you know, kind of, I don't want to say your Varus backups, your all-around backups, but champions that kind of work in a similar mold, your Tristanas, your Corkis. Xayah can theoretically fit into that, although she's more of a hyper carry, I would say, than Tristana or Corki are. All three of them can win early, all three of them can win late. They're not going to be super dominant in each regard. They both or all three of them kind of need resources in order to get where they want to go, but all three of them can do stuff. Like, if you really just want to pick something that's stable and Varus is off the board, I think all three of them can kind of fill that role. Xayah in particular is easily the best of these in terms of self-peel and also has the most damage in the late game. Corki's damage is definitely there in the late game, but it's a bit more difficult to execute on, although I think his laning phase is a bit better than Xayah's. And Tristana probably has the best laning phase out of all of these champions, but is also the most risky. Her jump obviously is very good if you're good at buffering a lot of CC, but, you know, Xayah's got better self-peel, and so does Corki, quite frankly. So, you know, I think all of them kind of do similar things, but at the end of the day, they're all going to be good. Like, you can pick any of them in game one, and I'm not going to get frustrated. You have, again, more all-arounders, but these are more weak-side all-arounders, things like Ezreal and Senna near the top of this. Ezreal you want to pick because of safety. Ezreal Karma has risen in popularity, especially as an answer to things like Kalista, and so if that does end up carrying through to the tournament, don't be surprised on that. You know, lane-dominant Ezreal still can exist because his poke is really good, and his ability to space, if you're a good player, is still really strong, but most of the time you're still picking Ezreal to play weak side and just be useful going into mid-game skirmishes. Senna is also a weak side AD carry, but you're, instead of playing for mid-game skirmishes, playing for late-game skirmishes, playing for team fights and things like that. They fill similar roles, again, just kind of spiking at different points in the game, weak side AD carries, if you will, and that kind of transitions, I guess, well into your utility ADCs, things like Jhin and Ashe. These are utility AD carries. Like, what do you want me to say? No resources. They can play strong side if they need to. They're pretty good in lane, but for the most part, they're there to enable either a carry mid laner or a carry jungler alongside, you know, a carry top laner or something like that. You don't want to play Jhin with no damage elsewhere on the team. Not really the direction you want to go, but Jhin and Ashe have been very popular all year. Ashe also popular as a support, again, as an answer specifically to Kalista. Don't be surprised if you see that at some point this tournament, especially with the players that we have here, but Ashe, I think, is better in the AD carry role, which is why I have her listed here. You've got your backup hyper carry in Kai'Sa. I say backup hyper carry. She's really the first hyper carry we've talked about. There are a ton in tier 3 that I will get into. I think Kai'Sa is the best of the hyper carries right now. I think her laning phase is really difficult to punish, and I think she's just more consistent than a lot of the other ADCs, certainly more picked than the other ADCs, so expect that. And then Miss Fortune's kind of your backup to Kalista and to Lucian, if you're not able to get them. Early game dominant, wants to play for skirmishes. The good thing about Miss Fortune is that she's basically always useful because of the ultimate. People have been proclaiming Miss Fortune's a horrible champion all year long, and they've been wrong all year long. She's been above 55% win rate in pro play in basically every region that she's been in. Super successful. She, again, kind of jack of all trades, master of none, but her team fighting is significantly worse than a champion like Varus's. So those are kind of the AD carries that I think you have to know because they're going to get played a lot, but I mean, there are a bunch that I didn't even name. Like, if you want early game pressure, you've got things like Caitlyn that I didn't talk about, Draven. You know, Hansam is going to be at this tournament. You gotta at least be prepared to see a Draven potentially come out. You've got hyper carries like Jinx and Sivir and Zeri and Smolder that are getting play that I didn't even mention. Hell, Twitch is starting to get play now in solo queue for a lot of the players going to this tournament. Like, it's just it's a very open AD carry meta. It really is just like, what do you want to play and where do you want to play it? A lot of these champs aren't inherently better than the other. I really do think that the only champ that's like definitely better than the others is Varus, and that's not because his power level at any point in the game is way better than other champions at that point in the game. It's just because his power level is so consistent throughout the entire game, and everybody else has like sections where they're good or sections where they're bad. You know, you can kind of take your pick of any AD carry. I don't think you're necessarily locking down a playstyle unless you're picking things like Kai'Sa or Zeri or Jinx, right? Like these hyper carries that kind of need to be enabled. That definitely indicates more so that you want to play for team fights. But outside of that, like, AD carry is super open, and it's really just about which player gets their hands on which champ. But that's going to bring us to our final position, which is, of course, support. And just like AD carry, I think it really is just kind of up to personal preference, but I do think there are champions that do each job just a little bit better in this one, and that's kind of showcased in Tier 1. A lot of the engaged threats are going to be here because they are going to get picked the most, and you're going to see them in most series, but I think the big difference between Tier 1 and Tier 2 is just these are engaged threats with actual playmaking potential, where the supports piloting them can go out and actually be primary playmakers for their teams, whereas I think a lot of the other engaged supports or tank supports that might be, as good as Rel, Nautilus, and Alistar are, maybe don't have quite as much individual potential to be able to kind of pressure in the same way that these champions do. But the Tier 1 for me is going to be Neeko, Rel, Nautilus, and Alistar. There was no doubt that Neeko was going to be in Tier 1, despite the fact that she is a little bit more niche. She has been rising in popularity, at least over the course of the past couple of months. I do think that she is more commonly played by supports now. I think at the beginning of the year, she was kind of looked at as a niche pick. That is not the case anymore. You kind of need to be able to play Neeko because, quite frankly, at a high-end level, Neeko is the best support in the game. If you can, execute the combo well, if you can find those flank angles, if you can get those big ultimates off, she's really good in lane. She has some of the highest base damages in the game. Again, some of the lowest base health in the entire game, and so she can be a bit of a glass cannon, but she's very good for poking in lane early, and that ultimate is just team fight shattering. Like, it is that good. If you want a playmaker to be able to express themselves, look no further than Neeko. And it's not a coincidence that a lot of the players that picked up Neeko early on in the year are here at this tournament. Players like Busio that I think have found a ton of success on this champ. So Neeko kind of needed to be here in Tier 1, but the other three, very obvious. Rel, Nautilus, Alistar, here are your three best engaged support tanks in the game, right? Like, Neeko's the playmaker. She's the one that's going to go out and make the big flashy plays, and, if you're really good at her, you can take over the game. Rel, Nautilus, and Alistar are like your stock standard engaged tanks. Like, every year, we're going to get at least three of these that are just better than the others. Right now, Rel seems to be the most consistent, certainly the one that I would value personally the highest, but Nautilus is the tankiest in terms of these three champions, and certainly the one that can survive the most. Alistar might just be the most effective in terms of playmaking out of these three. Rel's flash plays can be incredible. Like, they're all good. You know what these three champions do. They go in, they start fights for their team, or they sit back and they peel. They can do both because that's just what tank engaged supports do, right? Like, at any given time, there are going to be two or three of these that are just always played and always picked. And there's really not a lot that I can go into when it comes to them because they are just more picked than the rest. I think Neeko's the interesting one in Tier 1, and then, again, you get what Rel, Nautilus, and Alistar do, but that transitions us to Tier 2. Kind of a smaller Tier 2 than maybe what you would expect for support. That's because I think there are a lot of niche picks. Like, the Tier 3 for support would be pretty massive if I made 3 tiers, and I'll kind of talk about that, but these are the other 5 champions that I think are just going to see quite a lot of play at this tournament, whereas the others I think will get, play in specific situations. And those 5 picks are Poppy, Braum, Rakan, Leona, and Renata. Poppy we already spoke about in the jungle section. Being able to shut off dashes and also knock people out of fights, it's pretty darn good. Like, the objective control of Poppy sometimes rivals even that of Maokai. If you don't want to play her jungle, play her support. She's good in both roles. She's not very good in lane. I think that's the biggest problem, especially in a more 2v2 focused meta like we're kind of in right now. Like, you can scale, but skirmishing matters a lot, and Poppy can sometimes just be a little bit behind the 8 ball in comparison to maybe some of the other champions around this, level, especially something like Braum that she gets compared to a lot, but still is super valuable, and that brings up Braum. Braum has been rising a lot in popularity, and specifically as a partner for Lucian in the bot lane. You'll see no Nami, no Milio, or anything like that on this list, and I think a big part of that is because I feel pretty confident that Lucian will get picked a lot at this tournament with Braum as his support. Do I think that Braum is super valuable outside of that? Maybe. Do I think he gets picked like he is? No. I do think he's the best champion here in this Tier 2. I think he's very valuable and versatile. He's a good early skirmisher. As we all know, Braum's level 1 is one of the strongest in the game. Braum is the best protection champion in the game. In terms of peel, he offers a ton, and the right Braum player can be very aggressive as well in the late game, and so it really is just about how you pilot it. I love Braum as a champion. I think he can do a ton for your team, but he's mostly going to be used as an answer to, a lot of these other 2v2 lanes, and as somebody that can step up and actually punish and try to skirmish a lot in the early game alongside things like Lucian, as we talked about before. Then you've got, Rakan, who's probably the second best playmaker. I would say Rakan's kind of in the Neeko mold. I know that feels very strange to talk about, but, Rakan's a little bit tankier than Neeko, but at the end of the day, his main goal is to jump in, knock everybody up, charm them, and then then hope that your team can win the fight. It's very similar to Nico going in and just ulting and just trying to set everything up. You know, Rakan's a playmaker. If you want to try to get a player like On or a player like Busio, you know, these players that are a little bit more creative in their engages, if you want to give them the opportunity to be creative, these are the champions that they should be going for. Also, if Xayah's in the meta, Rakan is also in the meta. It's just kind of how it goes. Leona's your backup engage support. I think she is notably worse than Rel, Nautilus, and Alistar. I think that those three are definitely better than Leona right now, if only because I think her ability to be a playmaker and to like be full engage is just harder. If she commits, she has to full commit, and that means she can't peel. It's not quite the same as like an Alistar or a Nautilus that can kind of do both. Rel as well, who can kind of do both. She very much has to commit to which mode she's going to be going into, and I also don't think she's quite as good at engaging as those other champions are, even with Flash available. You know, Flash Rel ult or like a Flash Alistar knockup, that's way more consistent than Leona's engage. And so while I do think Leona is still very good and she should still get a lot of play, especially in Fearless, I don't think she's quite on the level of the other supports. And then Renata, this is because Kalista will get a lot of play. Renata will likely be over 50% presence just because she's one of the better enchanters in the game, even outside of Kalista, and also she is Kalista's partner in the bot lane duo. So those are your tier 2 picks. Again, a ton of tier 3 picks. I think it kind of just depends on what you're looking for. I excluded picks like Karma and Nami and Milio that I think are going to get picked at this tournament as, you know, complementary pieces to other AD carries. We talked about Karma Ezreal being a very popular lane. You know, Lucian Nami is still going to get played. Lucian Milio will likely get a game or two, even if I think people are starting to move away from the Milio hype train just in terms of how they are piloting that champion. You're still going to see them at this tournament. I just don't think it's going to be as common. I think Lucian Braum in particular is really emerging as the 2v2 for Lucian that people really like to go for, and Varus just wants an engaged support. He loves, you know, Rakan and Nico and things like that. You know, all the other hyper carries just want Nautilus or Alistar or Rel or whatever. Like, it's just a lot of the enchanters that were previously used as like meta, you know, duo picks, they're just not that good anymore. And so Karma, Nami, Milio, maybe they get play. I didn't feel the need to put them here. Lulu might get play at least a little bit as, you know, the enchanter if you want to play Zeri or Jinx or whatever. You know, if you want to play for that hyper carry in the bot lane, Lulu's great at being able to enable those. She's basically unpickable outside of that, at least in my opinion, in the current meta. You've got things like Bard that are kind of the third choice option for people who didn't get Nico or Rakan in the series. If you want a playmaker, if you want something that can be, you know, really active, some really good Bard players at this tournament, you know, they're going to pull it out. As for everybody, probably not a pick that exceeds like 20% presence rate. And then Blitzcrank, had to throw it out there because On is at this tournament and he's one of the best Blitzcrank players of all time. But again, hook champions outside of Nautilus just aren't very good right now. So those are the support picks, and that's really going to be it for the bot lane meta and for the general meta. All right, but that is going to do it for my MSI 2025 meta report video. We went through all 5 positions, kind of talked about the champions you can expect to see and why you can expect to see them and what roles you can expect to see them, like, you know, playstyle roles, not sort of position roles. We know what positions these champions play, but in what team comps you're expecting to see them, how early in the draft you're expecting to see them. Hope you guys enjoyed. Again, the primer video is going to be out tomorrow. That's power ranking every team and every player within those teams, and I'm very excited to get that out. I know it's some of you guys' favorite content. It's my favorite content to make at the beginning of any tournament, whether that's regular season or international tournament. I'm always very excited to make those primers, so stick around for that, and I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Like I said, we're going to be posting the primer video tomorrow, but we're covering every single day of MSI, basically right after it happens here on this channel. If you're interested in that kind of coverage, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when all of those videos go live throughout the entire month. But with all that being said, I hope you are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all